Often regarded as one of the most beautiful commercial airliners ever built, the Vickers VC10 would prove to be Britain's last home-developed long-haul airliner, its ambitions being to provide a technical tour de force that would do battle with the likes of the Boeing 707 and Douglas DC-8 for market supremacy by combining sheer power and performance with highly advanced flight controls. Unfortunately, the Vickers VC10 illustrated that it was far too advanced and far too powerful for many of the customers it was seeking to endear itself to, with maintenance and operational costs alone being substantially higher than the comparatively simplistic Boeing 707, thus meaning it was unable to garner even the interest of the UK flag carrier without direct intervention of the government. However, during its relatively short commercial service life, its graceful lines and comfortable cabin were appreciated by passengers and crew alike, while even beyond its original civilian career, the Royal Air Force would find a long-term role for these machines that saw action across the many front lines of the late 20th and early 21st century. In 1951, Vickers had been contracted by the Ministry of Supply to develop a large jet-powered troop carrier for the RAF designated the V1000, with a proposed civilian transport version dubbed the VC7, attracting not only the attention of British long-haul flag carrier BOAC, but also several American airlines due to its airframe and performance improvements over the upcoming Boeing 707. Sadly, in November 1956, with the prototype 80% complete, the ministry cancelled the contract due to what was stated as defence cutbacks and a spiralling development cost. And while it was hoped that BOAC would still be keen on the passenger version, the company declined due to perceived delays, a lack of confidence in the proposed engine, a financial commitment to the Comet 4 airliner, and a loss of faith in British products. The VC7, had it gone ahead, might well have been Britain's answer to the Boeing 707, but in 1956, BOAC, with government backing, ordered 15 Boeing 707-400s at a cost of £44 million, each to be powered by Rolls-Royce Conway engines. However, within a few years, BOAC would need to replace its Comet 4s and Britannia airliners on its so-called Empire routes, with many of the destinations served being equipped with short runways that were coupled to hot and high atmospheric conditions, which were proven to be unsuitable for the airline's 707s. Thus, by 1957, a new set of specifications emerged from BOAC that called for a fast jet capable of carrying loads of up to £35,000 over a 4,000-mile range to destinations in Africa, Australia and the Far East. And while several other British manufacturers came forward with their own designs, the Vickers proposal was subsequently accepted as a private venture, with the upcoming model dubbed the VC10. Calling on the expertise gained while designing the V1000, the VC10 concept was based on an uncluttered wing to give maximum aerodynamic lift, enhanced by the use of Fowler flaps, as invented by Harland D. Fowler in 1924, which created a split flap that slides backwards flat before hanging downwards, thereby increasing the wing's chord and then camber, this being combined with full-span leading-edge slats. Designed for excellent short-field performance, the wings could also be used to carry most of the fuel, the use of Fowler flaps within the thicker wing, necessitating the movement of the engines to the rear of the fuselage, together with a high variable incidence T-shaped tailplane to avoid jet efflux, the rear-mounted engines also helping to reduce possible debris ingress at the rough airfields of Africa and Asia. This configuration would give a higher payload, better economy, and, for passengers, much less engine noise, with other gains including reduced fire hazard in the event of a crash, while additionally, various V1000 design features were also incorporated, particularly the use of structural parts machined from solid blocks of metal instead of sheets, and the inclusion of supporting fuselage hoop frames for maximum strength. Room for 6 abreast seating was also achieved, while the flight deck technology was state-of-the-art, with quadruplicated automatic flight control to provide zero-visibility landing capability. BOAC signed a letter of intent for 25 VC10s in May 1957 with Vickers, though this proved to be a reluctant gesture, as even at this early stage the airline showed great reservations when it came to the aircraft's operational costs, the hope being that the production expenses would be shared among various other potential customers. Meanwhile, Vickers had calculated that its manufacturing break-even point was 80 aircraft, based on a unit price of £1.5 million, while at this stage, the proposed VC10 design had an estimated all-up weight of £247,000, with a payload of 38,000 pounds and seating for 135 passengers. The engines selected were four 16,500-pound static thrust Rolls-Royce Conway turbofans, suspended in pairs either side of the fuselage below the tailplane, these engines being selected to give parity with those on BOAC's 707-400s, thus giving the carrier more flexibility when servicing both types. As the VC10 development proceeded, it became clear to Vickers designers that relatively small changes would give the new airliner a transatlantic capability, enabling it to function over the whole of BOAC's route network, and could be achieved by increasing the Conway's power to 18,500 pounds thrust, adjusting the wing sweep by an additional half a degree, and extending the wingspan to 140 feet to provide greater fuel capacity. Given these amendments to the aircraft's design, BOAC signed a firm contract for 35 VC10s in 1958, with an option for 20 more examples, with deliveries scheduled to start in 1964. Much design time was taken up with wind tunnel tests, which refined the wing and the optimum position for the T-tail, while both the fin and tailplane had a greater sweep-back angle than the main wing to ensure that control did not deteriorate at lower speeds, the end result being a gross weight of 312,000 pounds, with power being provided by the uprated Conway RCO-42 engines, which each produced 20,500 pounds thrust. BOAC's own calculations showed that, by 1960, the VC10 would cost £4.24 per passenger mile to operate, compared to the 707's figure of £4.10, though due to a leak of this internal information onto the wider market ahead of the aircraft's launch, reportedly led to the loss of several potential overseas orders for Vickers, while within BOAC itself, there were calls to scrap the deal and purchase more 707s instead. In an effort to bolster interest in the program, Vickers, now part of the British Aircraft Corporation or BAC, began studies on a stretched variant of the VC10, which would be more economical to fly, this model coming under the designation Type 1151 or Super VC10. Tailored for the transatlantic market, the fuselage length was increased by 13 foot, and it could accommodate seating for 163 passengers in an all-economy class cabin, while the range was increased by an additional fuel tank in the fin torque box, and power was further enhanced by 22,500 pound thrust Conway RCO-43 Mark 550 engines. However, during the early 1960s, Vickers was experiencing financial difficulties, and there were doubts as to whether it could supply the original order for 35 standard aircraft without making further losses, the company therefore offering BOAC the Super VC10 variant at £2.7 million each. In response, due to a poor business forecast, the carrier was not convinced it still required its full commitment of 35 jets, though fortunately for Vickers, the government intervened in May 1961, and a revised contract was signed for 35 Super VC10s, plus 15 of the standard variant, 8 of which were to be constructed as combi aircraft, with a large cargo door and stronger flooring for future freight passenger rolls. With first deliveries imminent in 1964, BOAC announced it wanted to cut its original commitment for 35 Super VC10s to just 7, but the government stepped in again and guaranteed to take any overproduction as military transports, with the final total number of aircraft procured by BOAC eventually coming to 17 units. By contrast, though, the carrier's order for 707s remained unchanged, as this, together with the prolonged and well-publicised wrangling that went on during this time, further eroded overseas market confidence in the British product. The completed Type 1101 standard VC10 prototype, Golf Alfa Romeo Tango Alpha, was finally rolled out of Vickers production sheds at Brooklands Weybridge in April 1962, and after a period of ground testing, made its first flight on June 29th, with Vickers chief test pilot Jock Bryce and co-pilot Brian Trubshaw at the controls, being able to lift the airliner off from the constrained Brooklands runway, thus proving its short-field performance. Flight testing from the company's Wisley airfield showed that the expected cruising speed of 580 miles an hour was not being achieved, necessitating changes that included the chord of the leading edge slats being extended and Cushman wingtip devices which increased the wing's aspect ratio and reduced drag. This resulted in a final wingspan of 146 foot, while around the rear of the aircraft, beaver tail-shaped fairing extensions were added between the jet pipes of each engine pair to help airflow and further reduce drag. The first production VC-10, Golf Alpha Romeo Victor Alpha, made its maiden flight on November 8, 1962, followed by the second example, Golf Alpha Romeo Victor Bravo, on December 21st. This beginning 2 years of intensive flight testing, including visits to Aden, Beirut, Kano, Khartoum, Nairobi and Rhodesia, where the jet's hot and high performance proved to be entirely satisfactory. The type received its certificate of airworthiness on April 23, 1964, and the first example entered service with BOAC 6 days later on the carrier's regular rotation from London to Nigeria, while over the next few months, the new airliner replaced most of BOAC's Britannias and Comet 4s on its African routes, and within 18 months it was also being flown to the Far East. However, by the time the type entered service, many of the shorter runways on BOAC's Empire routes had already been extended to accommodate the 707 as well as the Douglas DC-8. The first Super VC-10, Golf Alpha Sierra Golf Alpha, flew on May 7, 1964, and was delivered to BOAC on December 31, 1965, with routes to the West Indies, Canada and the California coast being quickly established, and despite BOAC's initial reluctance to choose the VC-10, it proved extremely popular with crews and passengers alike, so much so that passengers and crews actively requested to fly aboard a VC-10. Crews reported it was easy to fly with minimal aircrew fatigue, while the aircraft's speed and comfort translated into fewer empty seats compared to the airline's 707s, with the Super VC-10 delivering even better economy with a cost per passenger figure that averaged £486 per revenue flying hour, compared to the £510 for the 707. These facts were not released by BOAC, however, for it was receiving a handsome subsidy from the government for having to fly the allegedly more expensive British airliner, and had even declared publicly that its purchase of the VC-10 was politically motivated. However, even with BOAC's reluctance to operate the VC-10, despite it delivering better performance and customer reception, Vickers themselves considered further variants in the form of a double-deck Super VC-10, known as the Type 1180, which was first unveiled in concept form during October 1965, only 8 months after the Super VC-10s had entered service with BOAC. Initially, the Super VC-10 Type 1180 had been changed into the 265-seater Superb by creating a larger lower lobe on the fuselage, which held another passenger cabin forward of the wing route, with the lower cabin holding 4 abreast seating, while the main deck offered 6 abreast seating for a total of 265 economy seats. The Vickers designers expected that the increased size of the airliner would vastly improve the cost per seat mile ratio of the model, as combined with the adoption of the upcoming Rolls-Royce RB178 engine with a thrust of 27,500 pounds and a high bypass ratio, the RB178 eventually evolving into the RB211 for the Lockheed L1011 TriStar during the 1970s. The Type 1180 and the subsequent Type 1181, which sacrificed 9 seats for an extra toilet in the lower saloon and extra storage on the main deck, was also offered with a main deck freight door as an option, and the lower deck had a freight door fitted for the forward passenger compartment, enabling a mixed freight passenger capability in various guises. Sadly, the Type 1180 would become a victim of BOAC's still fervent desire to procure American products, and while £40 million of launch aid was applied for in May 1966 for the new VC-10 variant, the British government denied it due to what was perceived as an insufficient market to justify the cost, with the upcoming Boeing 747 being a far more appealing prospect, and thus no further variations on the VC-10 were developed. As for construction of the VC-10, this would include a complicated delivery system, whereby the completed airframe was assembled at Brooklands, but with no interior fittings, due to the length of the runway at Brooklands being too short to handle a fully furnished VC-10 for takeoff. Thus, once the airliner had been completed, it would be flown with less than half a tank of fuel from Brooklands to BAC's other facility of Wisley, 2.5 miles to the south, which benefited from a longer runway, and was thus where final completion of the aircraft's fittings was undertaken prior to delivery to customers. Overseas operators of the VC-10 were confined to Africa and the Middle East, with Ghana Airways ordering 3 standards in January 1961, although one was subsequently cancelled, while the other 2 were built with the addition of cargo doors and were designated as Type 1102. One of the aircraft, 9 Golf Alpha Bravo Papa, was leased by Middle East Airlines from April 1, 1967, but this unfortunate unit would prove to have the shortest career of the VC-10s when it was destroyed on the ground at Beirut during an Israeli assault on the airport in retaliation for an attack on El Al Flight 253 2 days earlier by the Lebanon-based Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. Nigerian Airways initially ordered 2 standard jets in 1969, but later decided it couldn't afford them, instead leasing the second production aircraft, Golf Alpha Romeo Victor Alpha from Vickers, this unit being involved in the type's first fatal accident under the registration 5 November Alpha Bravo Delta, when it crashed while landing at Lagos on November 20, 1969, killing all 87 passengers and crew aboard. Meanwhile, back in the UK, leading independent carrier British United Airways, or BUA, acquired 4 examples of the type, including 2 Combi Type 1103s in 1964, the Type 1102 previously cancelled by Ghana Airways, and, in 1969, the prototype Golf Alpha Romeo Tango Alpha, which had been converted to a Type 1109 for Laker Airways, though this aircraft would subsequently be written off following a hard landing at Gatwick in 1972. Under BUA, their clutch of VC-10s would be employed on South American routes recently vacated by BOAC, and following the merger of BUA and Caledonian Airways to create British Caledonian, these units would be replaced by Boeing 707s and Douglas DC-10s during the mid-1970s, with one example being sold to the Sultan of Oman in 1974 and converted into a flying palace. Another user of the VC-10 was East African Airways, or EAA, a unified carrier formed through the combined efforts of Kenya, Tanzania and Uganda that provided both domestic services within Africa and international runs to Europe and Asia, EAA acquiring the final 5 Vickers VC-10s produced between 1966 and 1970, which proved to be ideal when operating to the hot and high airports of Nairobi in Kenya and Entebbe in Uganda. One of these, 5 X-ray Uniform Victor Alpha, was involved in the type's second fatal accident when it aborted takeoff from Addis Ababa Airport on April 18, 1972, thus causing it to overrun the runway, break up into pieces and catch fire, thus leading to the deaths of 43 out of the 107 people aboard, while the remaining 4 units continued to work for EAA until the carrier collapsed in 1977 amid deteriorating political ties between the nations behind its formation. Elsewhere, marketing overtures were made in Mexico, Argentina, Lebanon, Thailand, Czechoslovakia and Romania, often with the encouragement and backing of British political figures, but with no success, the only other international use for the VC-10 being primarily through second-hand purchases, as was the case with Gulf Air and Air Malawi. In the end, the only serious international consideration came from the Chinese CAAC Airlines in 1971, which placed an order in 1972 for several units, only to find that the VC-10 assembly line had been dismantled and all the jigs at the Brooklands factory had been broken up. Nations within the communist sphere of influence, including Czechoslovakia, Romania and China, eventually settling on the similarly built Ilyushin IL-62. Beyond civilian operations, the Vickers VC-10 also lent itself to military applications with the Royal Air Force, with 1961 seeing the Air Ministry sign a deal for 5 VC-10 transport variants to meet their specification C239, with this order later being increased to 11 when BOAC reneged on its original commitment, this being followed by an order for 3 Super VC-10s during 1964. All RAF VC-10s were designated as Type 1106 and built with a cargo door, reinforced flooring, and an extra fuel tank in the fin, and were powered by Conway RCO-42 turbofans, while also receiving an air-to-air refueling nose probe and an auxiliary power unit in an extended tail cone, the 14 RAF VC-10s being designated C Mark 1s, and were operated from RAF Bryce Norton under No. 10 Squadron. Back with BOAC, this would be merged with BEA to form British Airways during 1974 after a 2-year transition period, though by this point the company was exploring as many avenues as possible in order to replace their fleet of VC-10s, especially the standards, regardless of their exceptional reputation among passengers and crew, the 1973 oil crisis and the rise of operational costs being a motivating factor. During the same year as BA's formation, the airline, in a bid to reduce the cost of buying brand new Boeing 747s, offered to part exchange 3 of their standard VC-10s to Boeing, with these initial units being procured by the American aircraft builder and promptly broken up for scrap at London Heathrow after only 11 years of regular operation. The remaining standard VC-10s were all out of work with British Airways by the end of 1975, with 5 units being leased to Gulf Air until 1978, while 1 was leased to the government of Qatar for VIP transport until 1981, the last standard VC-10 in British Airways service, Golf Alpha Romeo Victor Mike, being retained as a standby for the Super VC-10 fleet until 1979. The Super VC-10 fleet, meanwhile, continued in service with British Airways into the late 1970s, but due to the introduction of more stringent noise reduction standards during 1980, meant the carrier had to either equip the aircraft with hush kits for the Conway engines or retire the fleet, British Airways opting for the latter, as the role of the VC-10s was soon to be occupied by the upcoming Boeing 757 and 767. However, during the airliner's time with British Airways, the VC-10 was noted to have achieved the fastest subsonic transatlantic flight to that point, when Golf Alpha Sierra Golf Charlie flew from New York's JFK to Prestwick in Scotland in 5 hours and 1 minute during March 1979, a record that was held until February 9, 2020, when a British Airways Boeing 747-400 covered a distance of 3,451 miles in just 4 hours and 56 minutes. Retirement of BA's Super VC-10 fleet began in April 1980 and was completed the following year, though due to the company having been unable to find other civilian operators, 14 of the 15 survivors would be transferred to the Ministry of Defence to bolster their fleet of transports and in-flight refuelling tankers, while the last unit, Golf Alpha Sierra Golf Charlie, was donated to the Duxford Aviation Society and flown to the Imperial War Museum on April 15, 1980. The conversion program for the VC-10s into RAF service had begun in 1977, when the RAF placed a contract with British Aerospace to convert 5 redundant BOAC standard VC-10s and 4 ex-East African Airways Super VC-10s into air-to-air refuelling tankers, which were designated as K2s and K3s respectively, this being followed by the 14 former BA jets and 5 additional airframes during 1990, together with the 13 original C Mark 1s during the same year. Throughout their RAF career, the VC-10s would take on a support role during the First Gulf War, the war in Afghanistan, the 2003 Gulf War, and the NATO bombing of Yugoslavia, their final military operation with the RAF being during the 2011 Arab Spring, when the British government provided tactical support to the uprising in Libya against military dictator Colonel Gaddafi. Eventually, with the arrival of the Airbus A330-based Voyager tankers and transport aircraft, the VC-10s in service with the RAF could finally be retired, the last units, which were employed by No. 101 Squadron and RAF Bryce Norton, being withdrawn from use on September 20, 2013, while the final flight of a VC-10 took place 5 days later, when Zulu Alpha 147 was flown to Bruntingthorpe for what was initially preservation. Today, 10 VC-10s are known to still exist in varying degrees of intactness, with 5 examples being complete airframes, while the remainder are fuselage sections only, with the last unit to fly, Zulu Alpha 147, being broken up at Bruntingthorpe in September 2022 after preservation efforts fell through, while formerly completed airframe, Zulu Alpha 148, was reduced to just the nose section during October 2023, when the Classic Air Force Museum at Newquay was forced to close. However, during August 2020, it was announced that Unit Zulu Alpha 150, preserved at Dunsfold Aerodrome, had been acquired by the Texas-based Kepler Aerospace for use as a potential air-to-air refueling unit, having previously attempted to procure ex-RAF Lockheed TriStars but to no avail, Unit Zulu Alpha 150 having been kept in a taxiable condition and is now registered as November 150 Zulu Alpha. In the end, the Vickers VC10 was an aircraft that illustrated many exceptional qualities during its working life, being immensely powerful, superbly performing, spacious, comfortable, sporting a quiet cabin, and being a culmination of technical wizardry that made the machine a pleasure to fly for crews and a joy for passengers who had nothing but praise for its in-flight experience and near-spotless safety record. Sadly, the VC-10's very conception was one obsolete by the time of its launch, the airliner having been designed to support a market that was rapidly diminishing, thus making its specialized features expensive to both maintain and operate, a testament to this being that BOAC refused to accept the model without government strong-arming, which also served to make the airliner deeply unattractive to other potential buyers. Nevertheless, the VC10, while noisy and expensive to operate, proved to be by far the greatest of Britain's domestically built long-haul jet airliners, as through its mixture of performance and safety, regardless of the cost, it provided an excellent service career for both civilian and military operators over the course of half a century. Truly one last hurrah to Britain's commercial aircraft industry.